Good afternoon to the next in Fractions peer-to-peer webinar series. For those that don't know me already, I'm Nigel Glisworth-Baldwin, co-founder of Phraktion, and joined today, I think, by Mr. Paul Reynolds, also co-founder at Phraktion. I'm sure you also know Paul by now as well. So just quickly, next slide, Elizabeth. So just tell you a little bit about Phraktion, if you don't know already. We have a bold ambition of changing how biopharma works. What we're really aiming to do is revolutionise how work gets done, really by providing a new model for accessing real expertise in pharma and biotech, moving beyond the traditional consulting and agency models. I'm sure much of us have touched those sorts of models in our careers and can definitely see room for improvement. That's really what we're aiming for at Phraktion. And we're doing that by providing really fractional top tier expertise. And I think, again, we'll have an exemplar this afternoon with Elizabeth's discussion around market access in Switzerland. I think that will speak very nicely to the very precise support we can provide to clients in providing solutions to their challenges. And beyond that, we do that through a global connected network of experts. And I think no better example of that is in the team in front of us today, coming from all parts of the globe, all with different expertise and knowledge over many years and decades often. So that's really Phraktion in a nutshell. And maybe to the next slide, which is the most important part of today. So Elizabeth will give this proper billing, of course, but just to say something about Elisabeth before we get started. So Elisabeth has 20 years of experience supporting clients with strategic and operational market access, HEOR and HT support for Switzerland. Her experience includes drugs, ATMPs, medical devices, lab tests, and medical services in general. Beyond Switzerland, actually, Elisabeth also has experience with reimbursement submissions and early advice meetings in Germany, UK NICE, Switzerland, TLV, and familiarity with EU GCA. So with that, hopefully that was appropriate billing. Elisabeth, over to you to take us through your very fascinating presentation. Thank you, Elisabeth.
With pleasure, thank you, and thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Pleasure.
So I have three unequal parts to the presentation. I thought first I'll give you a little country overview, helicopter view, because I don't know how familiar you are with the country at all. Then I have a little bit an overview of the different market access routes that exist, and the bulk of the presentation will focus on market access for innovative drugs, because speaking to Nigel, this seemed to be what most of you might be most interested in. If you have questions for other access routes, obviously contact me. The contact details are at the back. So country overview, I have some mountains too. And so Switzerland is one of the richest countries in Europe and one of the richest countries in the world. Here you see it at number 4 with a purchasing power adjusted GDP per capita. So if you want wealth per person adjusted across different countries, so it's comparable for just under $100,000. And it's apart from, so each of these countries, like Luxembourg is a tiny country with a huge financial services center. Ireland has a lot of company headquarters. Norway has oil, and Switzerland is kind of, I think, maybe the first of those countries that is a very diversified economy. Somebody might not like me for saying this, but forgive me. So it's a very rich country. It is second in the world for its per capita expenditure of health insurance, second only to the US. This is OECD data. So they spend on average, these are 2022 data, they spend on average just over $8,000, tendency obviously rising. So what's not to like?
Elizabeth,
it has a yes.
Sorry, I know I was meant to say that you're happy to take questions throughout the
Yes,
presentation.
please.
I think one has popped up from Edgar. Looking at the two slides back, looking at
Yeah.
Ireland, I think, and you seem quite high up on your chart for richest
I
countries.
was in Ireland, and to me, it didn't look very rich. Sorry.
You can argue with the World Atlas data or not. It depends how you measure it.
Yes.
I think what you see across the country is very often not what you see reflected in the statistics. There's also poor people in Switzerland. Um, I think they're rich because they have a lot of company headquarters, which may
Mm.
not necessarily be reflected in the firms that you might find where you go hiking. I don't know if that is your experience, if that helps.
Yeah. And I think as Paul has just commented, it's a tax haven. So as you said, a lot of companies
Yeah.
base themselves with a tax advantage in Ireland. Well, I think actually may be coming to a close somehow very soon. But let's see.
I mean, I remember, just to give you a bit of history, I used to work for Allergan, and Allergan was going to be acquired by Pfizer. Why was it acquired by Pfizer? Because it had its tax domicile in Ireland, and it could have washed 200 billion through
Yeah.
Ireland. So therefore, there would have been a lot of very expensive heads in Ireland put there for tax reasons.
Yeah. And if we take away Ireland, Switzerland becomes even richer in comparison. So I guess we agree that Switzerland is a fairly rich country viewed from a global perspective.
Indeed.
And regarding questions, I can't see the chat and I can only see three of you when I share the screen now. So please just interrupt me, or maybe Nigel, you can monitor the chat if you weren't gonna do that anyway, please,
Yes,
because I can't see anything.
myself and Paul have the chat in front of us, and we're just
Great, thank you.
monitoring that. So
So
we can come
I'm
back
not
to it.
ignoring you if I'm ignoring you.
Good. But please, everyone, just shout out, as Elizabeth says.
So we have all these positive things. It's very rich. It spends a lot of money on healthcare. So what's not to like? It has a relatively small population, so just under 9 million. In the past, there have been delays and complaints about time to regulatory approval and time to reimbursement. Like in every other country, I suppose there's talk of cost containment measures. On the positive side, with Swissmedic, it has its own regulator. It has a sophisticated healthcare system, high healthcare spending, and a willingness to adopt new treatments, which makes it a valuable test market for innovative therapies. It has a higher price level for innovative drugs than other European countries. So a recent report has put it at an average of almost 9% higher price level for patent-protected innovative drugs than other European countries. You can argue with the data a bit, but this gives you an idea. And also on the positive side, there's been some recent changes regarding pricing and reimbursement processes, which I'll go into in this presentation. Just to give you sort of a feel for it, we put kind of a controversial title, so country of first launch or an afterthought, because in my experience, I've seen very different ways how people treat Switzerland. So because it has its own regulator, I've seen, for example, oncology drugs being launched in Switzerland and the UK, first with third-line data derived from phase 2 trials. And the companies only went to EMA later with the phase 3 trial data where they were trying to get into second line. So I've seen that for several companies. I've also seen some people that when they started the process of applying for generalized reimbursement through the mandatory healthcare system in Switzerland and decided to withdraw after years of negotiation. They decided to withdraw their application. There are still ways of getting reimbursed in Switzerland. So there's a broad spectrum of how people treat Switzerland. So to start with, just to give you a brief overview of the existing market access routes in Switzerland. For the outpatient sector, for drugs, for example, you apply to the Federal Office of Public Health, which is the Ministry of Health. And there's within the Ministry of Health, there's different pathways to market access and different requirements for diagnostics devices and drugs. These are assessed by different commissions. Then if you want to get reimbursed in the inpatient sector, again, there's different pathways depending on the product, the time since launch. There's also direct negotiations with hospitals, or you can apply to the Swiss DRG system, so the flat fee system that applies in hospitals. You can't do this directly as a pharma company, but you can do it through medical associations and hospitals. And then you also have non-generalized reimbursement. So Switzerland has a healthcare system that includes a mandatory healthcare insurance that is administered through private companies. And then they also have top-up private insurance that not that many people have, but it gives you an additional route to pursue. You can do individual patient reimbursement requests to an individual patient's insurance, and that can cover both the mandatory insurance or the private top-up insurance. Sometimes there's also direct negotiations with insurances, again, both the mandatory or the private insurance component, instead of going the usual route of trying to get your drug listed on a positive, or drug device or a lab test listed on a positive list. So there's various market access routes that you can take. They're not always as obvious as they might sound by the name. And from what I understood, most of the people that might attend this webinar might be interested in innovative drugs. So I focus on that for the remainder of the presentation. The principles and the broad processes that apply to innovative drugs to some extent are also true for diagnostics and devices. So if this is your interest, you should still derive some benefit from the presentation or reach out to me separately. Do you have any questions so far?
Maybe one or two questions, Elisabeth. I don't know if you'll come onto this anyway. Talking about reference pricing in Switzerland and can it be used as a benchmark for other countries?
Yeah, I've actually tried to get decent data on this, and I failed, meaning various companies that specialize in pricing research. IQVIA would be one, Simon Kucher, ZS, or Phraktion. I'm sure there are specialists on there, and so they would have proprietary databases. I do not have access to specific pricing database, IRP database. From what I understood, but take this with a grain of salt, there should be at least 20 countries that reference Switzerland's price international, but I did not find a source that I can put my hand in the fire for. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Can I ask another question? I just
Sure.
call with JCR, Joint Clinical Assessment, is new. I just had 2 in April. So is that something Switzerland would also consider from the clinical perspective, or because they are not Europe per se?
Yeah.
But it could be that they look at it at some point and think maybe it's useful.
Of course. So 2 comments on this. Switzerland is usually keen to keep our taxes down and minimize the effort that they put in. So they piggyback on what other countries do. They explicitly, when you apply for reimbursement, they explicitly ask you to tell them what's happening in other countries, and that they have their own channels for finding out as well. And what is interesting is they don't just look at Europe, they also look at INES in Canada, for example, or sources in Australia. In principle, if it serves their purpose, they will look at any country that is vaguely comparable. Sorry, I lost my thread here. Yes, EU JCA. So they will definitely look at what is happening and once the reports come out. One thing so these recent changes that I'm going to talk about that gives you the system that exists now, they will change further as like the countries get experience with EU HTA, and they will definitely use it, especially if it serves their purpose and if it reduces their time and resources to get to an assessment. What you have to keep in mind, though, is because they have the Swiss regulator, and the Swiss regulator takes part in certain joint regulatory frameworks like Orbis or Access. Sometimes you have a different indication wording. So Switzerland might be closer to the FDA wording rather than the EMA wording for the indication, which might actually give you a different comparator, which will give you a totally different kind of negotiation. It's rare that it's that different, but it can happen. So they will decide on a case-by-case basis how they will make use of EU HTA. At the moment, they haven't said anything formally, but I'm sure they will.
Okay. Yeah, it's because
Does that help you?
Yeah, it's because of PICO. It could be different.
Yeah. Yes. And also what's a problem in that context is that you don't have an awful lot of time to prepare these dossiers once you know the final indication wording. Sorry, and you will see that another part is relevant maybe to your question as well, which I'll cover in the presentation, because Switzerland now has a new process for early dialogue and early access as well. Yeah, okay. So any other questions? That was one. I believe there was a second one.
No,
Or we've covered
you
that.
asking a question?
Yeah, it's a simple one, Elisabeth. I've been in a situation joining a company that has no Swiss entity. If I'm going to try and get access and price, who do I need in the country to do it? Can I hire them? Do they have to be permanent, or can I rent them? You know what I mean?
I'm not a regulatory person, so I don't know all the detail, but what I've seen companies do is they get an agency basically to do their regulatory filing in Switzerland, and they serve as the market authorization holder for that time, and then it gets transferred just before they're about to launch. I've seen cases where the two parties fell out and there were some issues which caused delays in the reimbursement. But you need an entity in the country,
right.
But you can kind of rent that person if you want. There are specialized agencies that do that.
Gotcha. Thank you.
There's several in Basel, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
I think we can move on, Elizabeth.
We move to the meat. So, innovative drugs, you want to apply for reimbursement. There's 4 steps you go through. So you submit your application your dossier basically, that has to conform to certain specifications. You submit this to the Federal Office of Public Health. Step 2 is they assess it. The ones that assess your innovative drugs application is the Drugs Commission. They work on a fixed timeline. They meet 7 times per year. And you know exactly when you will hear back from them with an assessment of your dossier. Step 3 is, so once they've assessed it, they communicate with you, like I said, on a fixed timeline, so you know when you're going to hear from them. They tell you the assessment result and ask you clarifying questions. This assessment result is basically always negative for innovative drugs because that's the legal basis for giving them the opportunity to negotiate. I've called step 4 the negotiation. Formally, it's not actually a negotiation, but I'm not a lawyer, so please forgive me. I call it a negotiation. This negotiation proceeds on an basically open timetable. You have to respond within a certain amount of time for the negotiation to continue. But basically, time is part of the negotiation, as opposed to, for example, in Germany, where it works on a fixed timeline. So this negotiation continues. Basically, it's a series of letters with attachments between the market authorization holder and the Swiss Ministry of Health. This negotiation continues until the Ministry of Health considers you meet the assessment criteria. I'll get to that in a minute. Or if you decide to withdraw because you do not see that you're going to get the price or the reimbursement conditions that allow you to continue giving the drug to Swiss patients.
When does this step 1 start? Do you need the Swiss medic approval, or can you start earlier?
You start earlier. So far, this is what's changed. I'll literally just get to it. So far it was when you get the positive opinion, like the provisional one, and you hand in usually you try to hand in as soon as you get this provisional positive opinion. And then you can only be reimbursed, like formally listed that it applies when you get the final positive opinion. But usually you get that faster than you finish the negotiation. And I literally just get to it in one of the next slides. There's a new process that speeds this up. What is important in Switzerland, in contrast to some other countries, is that pricing and reimbursement is decided in a single process, and they decide it in parallel. So your pricing and your reimbursement conditions, like your target patient population, they are not separate like in other countries, but this is all negotiated as a whole package. And like I mentioned, there's new methods guidelines that have been valid since January 2025. So you submit your application dossier to the Swiss Ministry of Health once you have the preliminary decision from Swissmedic, like I just said. Typically, it's taken at least 12 to 15 months to negotiate access for highly priced innovative drugs. There is now, since last year actually, since last year, there's this new early access process that wasn't published an awful lot. So it's kind of only become more public knowledge since these new methods guidelines came out in January, where you can, I'll jump. So where basically you can hand in your application the day you apply for Swissmedic regulatory approval. There's 2 steps or 3 steps in this. You send specific forms to them, which is called Early Dialogue 1. So this ED1 in the bottom left-hand corner here for the 4 squares, where you give them some basic information and that you can hand in theoretically on the same day that you ask Swissmedic for regulatory approval. This is then followed possibly by a second early dialogue, which is usually once you get a list of questions and you update the Swiss Ministry of Health of what happened with Swissmedic, with the regulatory authorities in the meantime. And if you get the approval, basically, that they allow you to go the early access route, you then submit your reimbursement dossier much earlier than you did so far. So in theory, this is supposed to speed things up. It creates the legal framework to speed things up. This process has existed since 2024. And so far, they published that 1 company has taken it up, only 1. And they're trying to make it more generally acceptable. I assume that one of the reasons why it was not taken up more is because it wasn't very well known, but also because obviously it implies an open channel between the regulatory authorities and the Ministry of Health with whom you negotiate pricing and reimbursement.
Is this only applicable to certain medications?
Yes. So the typical eligibility criteria, I don't know if you can read them, it's a bit small. So what they specify is these are typical eligibility criteria. The wording is such that they may also agree to apply this to other drugs that do not strictly meet these criteria. So it's worth a try maybe, but these are kind of the common ones. So for example, if you go through accelerated approval, if your product is subject to a joint regulatory assessment, for example, Orbis with Singapore, Australia, etc., if it's a rare disease, if it's an ATMP, gene therapy, or if the product is already reimbursed for at least 2 indications. Anyway, so a number of criteria. I think this covers quite a lot of cases that would apply to highly priced innovative drugs. Does that answer your question? Yeah. But like I said, don't take this as the end result. It's phrased in a flexible way so they can extend it to other drugs as well if they want to, if you make a good case. Okay? Do you have any questions on this right now? Otherwise, I would move back to the sort of the main framework. So whether you go through this early dialogue / early access pathway, or whether you go the regular route, the process, the timeline changes slightly, but the basic process of what you need to supply the authorities with and the negotiation process is the same. And I'll cover that here. So your dossier that you hand in has certain core sections, the usual efficacy, safety, the place in the treatment pathway, epidemiology, and budget impact, for example. The length is maximum 30 pages. Sometimes you get by with 31 pages, but it's strictly limited, and it has to be in one of the national languages. Usually it's in German or in French. You cannot do it in English. The appendices can be in English or Japanese or whatever. Once you hand in this dossier, the authorities assess you with 3 assessment criteria. In German, they're called the WZW criteria, which are the abbreviations for the German equivalent of, on the one hand, efficacy and safety. Secondly, something in German called Zweckmäßigkeit, for which there's no single equivalent in English. It's something like adequateness or usefulness. And the third criterion is economic efficiency. So economic efficiency, I use the wording deliberately. It's not necessarily cost effectiveness as it would be understood in, let's say, Anglo-Saxon countries where you do a formal economic model that is optional in Switzerland. Your economically efficient price is determined by a 50-50 weighting of therapeutic cross-comparison with basically treatment alternatives in Switzerland, and 50% weighing of international reference pricing. There's a basket of countries that's structured. They take an average price. The thing which is important is the therapeutic cross-comparison, where it's up to you to kind of make a good case with guidelines, key opinion leader interviews, let's say, or other sources to try and argue in favor of the comparator that you would like. In the new methods guidelines, they firmed up a lot of informal rules that they used before, where they make it harder for you to tell that story of what you think should be the comparator. In that, for example, you cannot pick a comparator for the assessment of efficacy that is not also a comparator concerning economic efficiency. So, for example, there has to be a drug that is reimbursed in Switzerland. But these are rules that they kind of applied already before, but they formalized it a bit. In addition to this economically efficient price determined by this 50-50 weighting, there's also the possibility of a maximum 20% and a maximum 10% innovation premium, which is added to the therapeutic cross comparison before they do the 50-50 weighting. And you you have the possibility of a maximum of 20% if your drug is assessed as being in the highest benefit category and 10% in the second highest. They're quite parsimonious in giving out these innovation premiums. They have been in the past already. They formalized in the new methods guidelines that you have to have a head-to-head trial. Otherwise, no innovation premium. And obviously, the head-to-head trial has to show what you're trying to say, and it requires a superiority test.
What about oncology? Because in oncology, of course, you have phase 2 trials, sometimes without a direct comparator, but you in other countries you get these preliminary approvals and to give the patients access to the new medication, and then you have to do your phase 3 trial.
Yeah. So you need to see where you can get with a therapeutic cross comparison and how you can argue there, obviously with evidence. But so as I said, you negotiate the whole package of all the 3 criteria: efficacy, usefulness, and economic efficiency together. We've had limited experience in the negotiation with the new methods guidelines because it is so new. The guidelines are phrased in a way that makes me think, since their job is to bring your price down, I think they would be extremely reluctant to give the innovation premium to you without having this head-to-head comparison superiority against the comparator that is used in Switzerland and that fulfills all their criteria, if that helps you. It's not what you want to hear. That's where the therapeutic cross comparison is important, or the KOLs, depends on your case.
Okay, thanks.
That's where the skill is. The skill is not in writing the 30 pages as such, but in the thinking behind it to prepare the negotiation that comes afterwards.
Yeah.
And I think I need to be careful of the time as well. So what I brought you here is, and the next 3 slides, don't be confused. You don't have to read it all. I'm just trying to illustrate something with this. So here I brought you an example of a listing in this positive list of drugs, the list of specialties, hence SL. I picked Spinraza nusinersen, which is a drug for spinal muscular atrophy. So there's different forms and types of severity of it, depending on the number of gene copies that people have. But in the worst form, it's the little babies that die before they're 2 years old. And maybe this is not typical. So this is a chronic treatment. There's also a gene therapy for it. I picked the chronic treatment because it illustrates quite well what I'm trying to show you, which are the main variables basically that they use to try and limit the budget impact. And this shows up differently to how it showed up on my slide. So the circles are not where they're supposed to do, but there's nothing I can do about that. So anyway, so can you see my cursor here? Yeah, okay. So here you have the different prices. So this is the ex-factory price and the public price. Then this lim tells you there's a limitation on prescribing. And this circle tells you that there's a time limit on the drug being reimbursed. So they're going to negotiate again on the 31st of March 2026. So whatever you read here is already limited. So here they tell you again, this is the wording of the limitation, and I just quickly don't get seasick. I just quickly go to the next and the slide after that to illustrate the whole text. Okay, so you have the first part here, then this is the second part, which is for kids, and this is for adults. Okay, and that's the whole text of this limitation. So I go back to the first slide. So they tried to limit prescribing by limiting this to specialized centers that are listed by name in this list. It has to be a specialist who prescribes and administers this. They reimburse in the first year of treatment a maximum of 6 packs. the patients are regularly assessed in terms of their response to the treatment, or if they lose any milestones. And here it specifies which morbidity scales will be used. It says specifically that patients will be assessed when the patient starts treatment, and then generally every 4 months or before each application of our drug in question. And if the doctor wants that the drug is given for longer than 12 months, they basically have to apply to what is called the trusted physician of the Association of Health Insurers. So they assess this again. So you're limited in time to 12 months. Then here you have specific criteria for reimbursement of this drug to kids before the age of 20, because this is paid by a different budget silo to the one that pays for the adults. So here it says only after an individual reimbursement request, basically. It specifies exactly how many gene copies patients are allowed to have. It specifies who is excluded, and it says when the treatment is supposed to be stopped. So if they lose any milestones, basically, the treatment will no longer be given / reimbursed. In addition, the license holder agreed to reimburse the insurance or the budget holder and a specified percentage of the ex-factory price. The specific discount is not listed here. Yeah. And something similar for the adults. This is paid by the health insurance for the adults. You can see the structure is the same. And if patients continue this treatment once they're an adult, sorry, no, the other way around. For patients that newly start this treatment after they complete their 20th year, there's an additional discount that is applied. And these are basically the kind of variables that are used to limit what patient population that this is given to. And this is maybe a more extreme example, but these kind of restrictions are fairly typical for highly priced drugs, for example, oncology. Like there was a question about it before. Is this clear?
Just one
Okay,
question,
here.
Elisabeth.
Yes, please.
Just about the confidentiality of any rebates negotiated. There's obviously what's public here. What about, we always hear that in industry, the pharma company wants to keep certain things quiet. Is Switzerland transparent or non-transparent?
Of course not. Like it wouldn't, it would, there's constant public debate. Yeah, of course. And everybody tries to get the best deal. It is very difficult to keep it confidential, I think, in the longer term from my experience. But yes, so they try and keep more to simple discount schemes because of the difficulty of keeping things confidential. And there's quite an administrative burden on who you have to send the bill to and who knows what. Like, it was interesting. I was part of one of the earliest cases where something like this was done to that extent, to speak a bit cryptically. And a lot of the discussion was literally on the logistics of it within the Swiss healthcare system. Right. So beyond your dossier, you need somebody that's good, that knows the Swiss healthcare system and that is good at talking to people and figuring out the logistics of it. Having said that, I think they do have some experience with it now.
Thank you.
Okay, so I've talked about this early dialogue and early access before. I don't think there's a lot else I can say about it. we said that this application can be started the day you apply to Swissmedic for regulatory approval. It's up to the Swiss Ministry of Health to decide whether they want to take you into this early dialogue and early access process. And so far, there's not been a lot of experience with this, read almost none. But in theory, at least, if both parties manage to agree on price and reimbursement conditions that work for both parties, in theory, that allows you to be reimbursed through the mandatory health insurance system that basically immediately following Swissmedic regulatory approval. In practice, it usually means the month after you get the regulatory approval, because there are certain legal things that need to be done for you to be listed in this positive list. Okay.
I'm just going to comment, Elizabeth, that I see actually a comment from our early access expert, John Lagos, saying it's very interesting to see this approach.
What is difficult? Sorry, I interrupted
I don't know
you.
if John has
finished.
anything to add around that, but he was just commenting it's very interesting to see.
Yeah, I mean, as it relates to the opportunity in Switzerland, I think it's really innovative approach that they're taking here. So yeah, it's great to see that those changes in regulations, and I wasn't aware of it. So a good learning point for me.
That's great. I think what we have to be careful with is the way they use the word early dialogue and the way they use early access here is slightly different to what you might understand using those words in other countries. So for example, in Germany, there's something called an early dialogue, but that's a different thing. That's usually where you talk to them about what should be in your dossier, your reimbursement dossier. That's one part, but often you go to them to kind of ask them if they agree to the endpoints and the design of your phase 3 trial. So early dialogue here used in the very specific Swiss sense as they define it here. So this is prior to you handing in your dossier. It's not designed to talk about your clinical trial design. And again, early access, this is part of the regular route because the actual listing and the actual reimbursement through the mandatory health insurance will happen through the regular routes, just quicker than what they did in the past, if you can agree in time. So the equivalent of what is called early access in some other countries is what in Switzerland are called individual patient reimbursement requests, where literally it's for a named patient.
And so that is reimbursed, or is the sponsor obligated to provide the medicine free of charge? I'm curious.
They usually, obviously, they like this. It's not necessarily free.
Okay.
Yeah, so we had the typical eligibility criteria for this early dialogue / early access. And again, this is what is typically required. There may be cases where you might be able to enter this process with a drug that does not satisfy these criteria. I would have thought that by experience, one thing that moves the needle is unmet need, obviously. So here they mentioned the accelerated approval, which I guess would cover most of these cases, but maybe not all of them. So I included a slide maybe to finish up on the key differences between a Swiss reimbursement application and that of other countries, which I hope is helpful. So there's differences with respect to the process and the timelines, the content, the assessment, and the publication of the process and assessment results. So going to the left to the process. In contrast to some other countries, it's an open negotiation. So they will, for example, purposefully delay your negotiation if they, for example, have another application in the same indication, and they will try and reach a positive result for them if it serves them, by negotiating with all of you at the same time, even if that means delaying things. You equally can use the delay or to speed things up in your favor as a pharma company if it serves you, subject to the Ministry of Health responding quickly. And the timeline for the initiation of the process is obviously linked to the Swiss regulator, not EMA. And as I said before, for some cases, especially for some of these highly priced onco drugs, they might work more to an FDA timeline rather than to an EMA timeline, which gives you options maybe. Regarding the content, so a Swiss dossier, I told you that it's maximum 30 pages with then a lot of appendices, obviously, but it's obviously not a copy-paste from a German AMNOG dossier or a French HAS or an English NICE dossier. That doesn't work. It's usually not even worth the effort to use text blocks, but to just write them from scratch because it's much faster. So your core dossier for Switzerland is extremely condensed. And what matters is that you have more leeway than in some other countries to basically tell a convincing story. Having said this is not a marketing story. Obviously, you have to back it up with data and it needs to make sense. And you have to basically compile this dossier already with the negotiation and your various scenarios for your negotiation in mind. Rather than going into it blindly, where they then determine which target patient group, let's say, to include or to exclude. Yeah. In contrast to, for example, a German AMNOG dossier, a Swiss dossier is based on peer-reviewed publications of phase 2/3 trials. So you do not have to provide CSRs. In some cases where there are no peer-reviewed publications, obviously you find another way, but generally they want peer-reviewed publications.
Would they accept real-world evidence studies? Would they accept real-world evidence studies?
They do. Obviously, they will apply evidence-based medicine standards to them. So it depends how important, let's say, the issue is that you need the real-world evidence study for. If you're talking about an external comparator, for example, they would apply international standards to this. And generally, I guess everybody has their own agenda, but if they can find a methodological weakness in what you produce, they will use it. Having said that, if there's an unmet need, because they negotiate this as a whole package, they're not totally evil, let's say. So they will consider your evidence, and yes, definitely they will consider real-world evidence. Whether that carries the day depends on the specific case and the methodology that you used. You do not need, in contrast to, for example, a German AMNOG dossier, you do not need an extensive additional statistical analysis, at least for the dossier. They might ask for additional information later on post-submission, but usually they're fairly okay usually if you say, look, we did not collect this data, or if you tell them there's no point in doing a subgroup analysis on 5 patients or something like this. And also a difference in the content is that you can supply an economic model like what you would what you would hand in for NICE, but it's not required. Often it is counterproductive because it's not so easy to understand. So in a lot of cases, I would keep the economic model sort of in my backpack that I have for the negotiations, but I would not present it up front. When you remember that I said your price is based on, more generally, is based on this 50-50 weighting of your therapeutic cross comparison and your international reference pricing, it is not mandatory that your therapeutic cross comparison is only for 1 year. So you can try and bring in an economic calculation at that level, where you go over several years or decades, but usually you do not supply a very complicated economic model as part of the dossier. Then you negotiate regarding the assessment. A difference between Switzerland and other countries is that you negotiate this package, including all three criteria. So the efficacy and safety, the adequateness/usefulness, and the economic efficiency. And so it's not that they require one to be fulfilled and then you negotiate the other two, but sometimes you can get to a situation where, say, maybe because of confidentiality, if they're negotiating several things in parallel, you get to a situation where you might accept something that makes zero sense as part of the therapeutic cost comparison, because that helps you move on one of the other criteria so that you can negotiate a whole package faster. Yeah, and you have to compile your dossier with the subsequent negotiations already in mind. And they've not been terribly transparent in the past in terms of what is published, which is both good and bad. There'll be slightly more transparency going forward, but it's less than in some other countries, like, for example, Germany. Do you have any questions on this?
The killer question. So is it easier to get an approval in Switzerland or harder than Europe?
I'm not talking about the approval. Approval is regulatory, nothing to do with me.
Well, okay, to get reimbursement.
It depends on you. If you want sky-high prices and you have no evidence, I think it is as hard as it is in other countries. It is different. It depends on the individual case. Sorry if it sounds like a cop-out. It's really true. In my opinion, I cannot give you a valid answer by answering it in a binary fashion.
The consultant's answers, Elisabeth. That's always a consultant's answer. It depends.
Yeah, but genuinely, one case does not fit all. What I appreciate actually about the process, in contrast to, let's say, if anybody's ever sat in this big in Germany, once you have to go to this big room where they take you apart basically for your reimbursement dossier. I forgot what it might be called in English, but the one where the head of the GBA basically tells you you're an idiot and everything you say is a lie. In contrast, Switzerland is polite in the way they deal with you as a person. It's professional. They do not hate you because you're an evil pharma company, but they might be quite hard regarding the content, but it's a negotiation that is not per se unpleasant. Yeah, like you might get in some other countries where you need a lot of alcohol after you come out of this meeting.
Or before you go in.
I'm sorry?
Or before you enter the building.
Yeah, I would do it afterwards, but I think your thinking is quicker if you do the alcohol afterwards. Yeah, so I think it's more pleasant. What I like from my perspective is that it's less bureaucratic in the sense that I have more scope for telling a story and to write well if you want, to tell a good story as long as I can back it up with the data. So our question was Switzerland, first launch country or afterthought? I saw the poll that you posted, Nigel. So the last I checked, it was about 50-50 with people saying yes, they would consider it as a first launch country and 50% saying no, it's an afterthought. It may not surprise you, my answer. It's a consultant answer, but again, I don't think I can give another one. So Switzerland is a first launch country for some companies, definitely in Europe. For others, it is an afterthought. Obviously, so there's been recent changes where they've formalized certain assessment criteria, for example, regarding the innovation premium and the price models, so managed entry agreements, that might make it harder. At the same time, they've implemented measures like this early dialogue, early access option, which helps speed up access. So overall, Whether that will make Switzerland the country of first launch or an afterthought cannot be answered with a one-size-fits-all approach, but it depends on the company, the product, the indication, and I guess the competitive landscape at the very least. I hope you found this useful. Thank you for your time and attention, and thank you to Phraktion for giving me the opportunity to talk about this. If you have any other questions, please ask now or reach out through the Phraktion profile. I'll stop sharing. Yeah, sorry, no, we had some slides from you. Sorry,
That's okay.
I moved.
They're not important slides. So,
Yeah, so
as Elisabeth says, please reach out to Elisabeth through Phraktion or directly. Just say, if there's any other final questions, I know we're just about out of time, but if there's any final burning questions, shout out now.
I think again, my experience of Switzerland is it punches above its weight, and it's relative to how hard it is in other markets. So for me, Switzerland was always an early market if we could get in, because you could be running the Swiss registration and the access process almost in absence of everything else. So why wouldn't you do it and have Switzerland give you a good price with a wealthy and well-insured population, and you could have a market that was operating successfully whilst you were still fighting the usual suspects in the rest of Europe. And it would never really affect your price basket. It would always probably assist it. That was my experience anyway.
So, general thumbs up for Switzerland today. Definitely.
Very good presentation. Thank you.
Fantastic. So just summarize, I think probably a fair answer would be that certainly Switzerland shouldn't be an afterthought, at the very least, but certainly a consideration for first country launch.
Not if you're using Elisabeth to get your application in, I'd say.
Absolutely. That's the next point, of course. Paul, that's, again, you're exemplar, many others across the team here, really providing really best-in-class, best experience, expertise, really on offer across Phraktion's global team, which is really how I set out Phraktion at the front of the webinar. So again, thank you, Elisabeth, and everybody for really demonstrating that for Phraktion today. Really very powerful, I think. So with that, you'll see tomorrow, I think, details of the next webinar in a couple of weeks, actually looking at timing of commercial and when they should get involved in the drug cycle process. So look out for that in a couple of weeks from Mike Campbell. And with that, thanks everybody. Thank you again, Elisabeth. We'll see you.
And just to say, the recording will go into our YouTube. It's one of the questions that'll be dealt with in the next few days.
Yeah, Elisabeth will go viral very soon.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Elisabeth. Great presentation.
Thank you very much, and have a nice evening. Thank you.
Elizabeth.
Bye.